All right, settling in. Tonight we're stepping back in time, not into the grand halls of power, but into the forgotten corners. We're focusing on the ordinary folk of the medieval age, the people without coats of arms or fine silks, those who simply endured the brutal realities of plagues, starvation, bone-deep cold, and countless small indignities. They had no titles, no fame, nothing but hard work, and a quiet tenacity that most of us today could barely imagine possessing. If this slow, calming journey into the past helps you relax and perhaps drift off, feel free to tap that like button and subscribe. Truly, only if it adds a moment of peace to your evening. And please let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is. There's something grounding about knowing others are finding calm in the same quiet story. So, lower the lights, maybe switch on a fan for that gentle background drone. Get comfortable and let's begin at the world's edge. Picture a village. It has no name anyone remembers, nestled in a gentle dip of the land, a soft fold far from any significant roads, far from official records, far from royal notice. You wouldn't locate it on a map, even if you owned one, which you don't. You've never even seen a map. Here, the world simply stops where the dense forest begins. The woods are vast and ancient, seemingly watching you with slow patience. The fields stretch out in rough, uneven patches of green and brown, worked to the point of exhaustion, then pushed even harder. Somewhere to the north, there's a river. You haven't seen it, but stories speak of it with the same hushed reverence. One might use for mythical beasts or holy figures. This is your world, the place you were born, the place you will die, perhaps 50 paces from one point to the other. The dwellings are low and weary, as if the wind has battered them year after relentless year. Walls are built from wattle and daub, woven sticks plastered with mud, straw, and dung, patched over and over with whatever spare bits can be found. Roofs are thick thatch, sagging under their own mass, perpetually dripping in spots you can't quite reach to mend. The air here carries the scent of wet wool, wood smoke, and damp earth. A faint tang of livestock, a hint of decay. None of it registers as unpleasant anymore. It's simply the smell of existence in this place. The path leading into the village isn't really a road, just a muddy track carved by ox carts, forming deep ruts that hold puddles and attract insects. No one of consequence has travelled it for years, maybe ever. Most days unfold quietly. A distant church bell from a neighbouring hamlet might occasionally mark the hours if the wind is right. Otherwise, time is measured by the sun's arc, the length of shadows stretching across the fields, or the familiar ache that settles in your back before midday. There are perhaps a dozen or so families here, enough to fill the small chapel on feast days. Everyone knows everyone. They know each other's struggles and mostly leave them unspoken until unavoidable. The village elder, such as he is a man named Thomas, who once conversed with a travelling monk and now recounts the story as undeniable proof of his great insight. No one challenges it. Thomas's hut hasn't fallen down. His goat appears healthy. That passes for leadership. Nothing here is precise. There are no written records, no formal boundaries. Land ownership is understood by landmarks. Past the old oak, where the stream bends. Any disagreement is resolved with a shrug, a brief spat, and sometimes a loaf of bread exchanged until tempers cool. There's no schoolhouse, no place for drinking, no lodging for strangers. If a newcomer arrives, it is discussed for weeks. Where are they from? What do they seek? Are they carrying misfortune? Do they smell of the sea? The arrival of someone unknown is both captivating and slightly frightening, and no one truly leaves. The idea of travelling far is less a plan than a whispered tale. You've heard of towns, of large settlements, of places where buildings rise 2 or even 3 stories high, but these are just stories like those about talking animals or women who shapeshift into birds. You cannot miss a world you have never witnessed. The forest is too dense, the hills are too long. Any roads that exist are notorious for robbers and bad luck, not for safe passage. What would you even do? Even if you reached one of those distant places, you don't speak their way, you have no money, you don't know their customs, you don't even know exactly how old you are. So, you remain. There is a certain safety in the familiar, even though it is difficult, even though it is monotonous, even though the roof leaks and the well is sometimes low and the same stew has simmered in the pot for 3 days. There is reassurance in the routine, in knowing where the firewood is, stacked in knowing which neighbor might help mend your fence, in knowing which stretch of sky tells you when to bring the sheep in. You wake with the first light. You sleep when it fades. You work in between. It isn't a grand life, but it is life. And somehow, in the quiet, steady rhythm of it all, there is a form of peace. A peace that doesn't ask complicated questions, that doesn't need to understand anything beyond what can be seen from the highest point on the nearby hill. Occasionally, you might hear talk of a war or a king's passing or a strange star that appeared in the sky and terrified a village 5 days' walk away. But the news never arrives directly. It's just stories, filtered through too many mouths to carry urgency. They lose their weight somewhere between the travelling merchant and the shepherd's cousin. Even time feels different here. Seasons don't change cleanly, they blend into one another. A damp spring flows into a wet summer. A hard frost transforms into a biting winter that seems to chew at your boots. You don't count the years, you count the harvests. The dry ones, the wet ones. The bad one when the rye turned black with blight. The good one when the barley grew thick and heavy. And even old Marjorie managed to smile for a week. You know the name of the Lord who owns this land, though you've never seen him. His steward does visit. He collects the grain, asks his questions, makes notes. You answer carefully, giving just enough information, never too much detail. He doesn't seem to care for detail. You've never met the king. You're not quite sure what his purpose is, but you know his name and you utter it when you pray, just in case it matters. Because here, on the fringe of things, most things don't change. And when they do, it is rarely for the better. Still, the fire glows, the roof mostly holds, the small house is warm, and tomorrow the same sun will rise over the same hills. For now, that is sufficient. In your lifetime, you will traverse many miles, but nearly all of them will be within a small radius. Most people in the medieval countryside rarely ventured more than a few miles from their birthplace. This wasn't due to a lack of curiosity or spirit or even good footwear. Although decent boots were indeed often a luxury, it was because the world beyond the nearest rise didn't truly belong to them, and the notion of setting out to discover it felt as improbable as sprouting wings. You grew up learning the names of every patch of ground between your dwelling and the edge of the furthest field. You knew the distinct shape of every tree stump on the path to the water source. You could identify who had passed along the track by the specific pattern of their footprints in the mud. Everything beyond that felt theoretical. The next village might be only 5 miles away, but it felt as foreign as another country. You'd heard stories about it. Who had married whom? Who had been accused of stealing a goat? Who had dared to say the priest snored during the service? But you hadn't seen it, and likely never would, because travel was fraught with peril. Not the exciting, adventurous kind, but the quiet, draining, potentially deadly kind. Roads were not well-maintained routes lined with signs and places to rest. They were mostly just muddy trails cutting through forests, fields, and long stretches of very empty, very silent land. No maps, no precise directions, just vague guidance like, follow the path until you reach the leaning pine, then turn left, past the rock that resembles a sleeping pig. And on these paths, many things could trouble you. Firstly, the woods, medieval. Forests were not tranquil parks. They were not picturesque or inviting. They were thick, dark, choked with roots and undergrowth, filled with sounds you couldn't easily place. Wild boar, wolves, people who wished to remain hidden. If you weren't raised in the depths of the forest, it seemed to resent your presence. Secondly, outlaws. Individuals with nothing to lose and no patch of ground to cultivate. Travelers were vulnerable, especially if they appeared even slightly well-fed. A person walking with purpose might be assumed to carry coin. A woman traveling alone might be seen as having something worth taking. You learned quickly that outward confidence offered no protection. Thirdly, losing your way. This was not a minor inconvenience. If you strayed from the track, there was no one coming to search for you. You couldn't just follow a river downstream hoping for civilization. You could wander for days without encountering another human soul. Your body could simply vanish into the thicket as if you were smoke. People might not even realize you were gone until the next feast day, when someone finally inquired about you and someone else simply shrugged. Then there were the practical concerns. If you traveled too far, who would tend your small plot? Who would ensure the animals were fed? What if the Lord Steward arrived to collect the tax while you were away? You could not offer absence as an explanation to a man clutching a ledger. Your daily obligations did not pause merely because you were curious about what lay beyond the horizon. And even if you did manage to reach another village, what then? You were not expected. You were not truly welcomed. Outsiders often brought trouble. Sickness, crime, peculiar notions. You would speak a slightly different form of the language, use different common phrases, perhaps even hold your eating tool differently. You might be met with suspicion or worse. Hospitality was not guaranteed everywhere. Food was scarce, and sleeping spaces were already occupied. The safest place was home, not because it offered perfect security, but because it was known. You knew precisely where the roof leaked, which hen wandered too far afield, which neighbor might lend you a tool without excessive questioning. Out there, no one owed you anything. Still, people did travel occasionally, not usually peasants, but those with a specific status, merchants, monks, messengers, individuals with either protection or a clear purpose, or both. You might catch a glimpse of them once or twice a year passing through with wagons laden with wool or preserved fish, trailing stories behind them like the smoke from their campfires. They spoke of cities where dwellings were constructed of stone, where shops sold exotic spices, and where people walked on surfaces that didn't turn to mud with every rain shower. It sounded fantastical. You would listen, but you didn't dare to dream too intensely. Because even if it were true, what would you do in such a place? You couldn't read, you possessed no currency, you wouldn't understand which customs were expected. The city could consume you whole, and no one would even know your name, so you remained. Not because you were fearless, although sometimes you were indeed afraid, but because you had duties to attend to. A fence needing repair, a younger relative needing supervision, a small amount of barley needing to be dried, and a dozen other tasks that demanded attention before the sun sank below the tree line. And because, in truth, you didn't need the world to be larger than it was, the village was sufficient. It had its share of gossip and disagreement, difficult weather and illness, and fleeting moments of happiness. It had the dependable rhythm of the bells and the turning of the seasons and the quiet satisfaction of having survived another day. Sometimes you dreamt of seeing what lay past the woods, but most days you simply hoped the stew wouldn't catch. On the bottom, while you went to fetch water, the village was enough. It had gossip and conflict and weather and sickness and fleeting joys. It had the rhythm of bells and the turning of seasons and the quiet pride of surviving another day. Sometimes you dreamed of seeing what was beyond the woods, but most days you just hoped the stew wouldn't burn while you fetched water. A few individuals did leave, usually those driven by despair or recklessness, occasionally those with ambition. A young man might venture out in search of labor or excitement or a cause he believed was worth dying for. He might return with a permanent limp or a remarkable story, or he might not return at all. And when he didn't come back, not much was said. People would simply shake their heads and say he had gone beyond the trees, as if that simple phrase explained everything. Perhaps, in a way, it did. For those who stayed, life was small, but it was also predictable. You weren't truly lonely. Your days were shared with family, neighbors, animals, and the land itself. There was comfort in the repetition, comfort in the familiar complaints. You didn't need to see a distant city to grasp the value of warmth, or taste cinnamon to know the simple pleasure of sweet bread, or cross an entire kingdom to feel love, or sadness, or boredom, or hope. And as the years passed, and the aches settled more deeply into your joints, and the young ones grew taller than the fence posts, the desire for travel faded, not with regret, but with a quiet understanding. Some people were meant to journey, you were meant to stay. For the typical medieval peasant, food was not an enjoyable experience. It was neither colourful nor varied, and often not even very warm. It was more akin to a recurring problem that had to be addressed each day using the same limited resources and the same weary hope that something edible might result. Your kitchen, if one could call it that, was a section of your single-room dwelling near the hearth. There was no separate storage area, no shelves lined with ingredients, no carefully dried herbs hanging in a sunny spot. There was just a single pot, a fire, and a short list of items you hoped had not yet spoiled. At the core of nearly every meal was pottage, a kind of perpetual stew that resided in the pot and never entirely ceased cooking. It was never completely new and never entirely finished. You added ingredients during the day, you skimmed it at night, you kept it warm through the different seasons, and offered silent prayers that nothing unpleasant would grow in it when your attention was elsewhere. The ingredients depended entirely on what was available, which was usually very little. On a good day, pottage might contain cabbage, leeks, barley, and perhaps a few legumes, possibly garlic or onions if the harvest had been generous. If it was winter, you used dried beans or peas. If you were exceptionally fortunate, a small piece of salted pork might be added. More often, it was just the bone. Even that was valuable. You could boil a single bone for days, hoping it might impart a faint memory of what meat tasted like. The flavor profile was consistently the same. Earthy, somewhat grey, more about temperature than actual taste. You didn't consume pottage for pleasure. You ate it because it was what you had. A warm meal at the close of the day was more than comfort. It was a small victory. The pot itself was rarely truly cleaned. It was wiped down, sometimes scraped, but seldom scrubbed thoroughly. The next batch always absorbed the residual flavors of the previous one. There were no spices to mask the taste, no vinegar to brighten it, just a slow, dependable sameness, a taste like boiled history. Bread was the other fundamental element, not soft or golden or enticing, but hard, dense, and dark. It was typically made from rye, barley, or oats. Wheat, the fine white variety, was reserved for the wealthier classes. Peasants could barely afford to see it, let alone use it for baking. The loaves were small and heavy. They didn't rise much. They crumbled quickly. If you left them out for a day, they could likely serve as a formidable weapon, but they did fill the stomach and provided something to dip into your stew. Sometimes the bread was made from questionable flour, containing chaff, ground-up peas, or whatever remnants were found at the bottom of the miller's bin. In times of extreme hardship, people resorted to using tree bark not as a metaphor. They literally ground up the inner layer of bark and mixed it with whatever limited flour they possessed. The result was famine bread, bitter, dense, and difficult to digest. It kept you alive. Technically, on days when even flour was scarce, people used trencher slices of stale bread as plates. These absorbed the stew and were either consumed at the end of the meal or given to the animals. Occasionally, they were passed down the table to individuals of lower standing. Bread, hierarchy at its finest. Protein was a rarity, a great rarity. Chickens provided eggs, cows provided milk. You did not consume your livestock unless there was absolutely no other choice. When you did, you utilized every single part: the meat, the fat, the internal organs, the bones. The blood was used for puddings, the fat was rendered down. The head might be turned into soup. Nothing was wasted. Pork was the most common meat when it was available. Pigs were efficient animals, and their salted fat provided flavor to many dishes, often transforming something barely palatable into something vaguely pleasant. But pigs were only slaughtered out of necessity. Processing an entire pig involved weeks of planning, salting, hanging, boiling, and storing. Fishing was an impossibility if you resided near water, but even that came with limitations. Many rivers and lakes were controlled by the local lords, and fishing without obtaining permission could result in a fine or something far worse. When you did catch fish, it was typically eels, small river fish, or anything that wouldn't spoil instantly. Salted herring, if you could acquire it, was considered a valuable item. The dictates of the church influenced your diet considerably, as well. On Fridays and during the period of Lent, meat consumption was forbidden, so you switched to fish or simply went without. In more imaginative times, beaver tails were controversially classified as fish, a theological loophole that few dared to question because it provided something to eat. Milk was commonly available but also perishable. You had to consume it quickly or transform it into cheese or butter. Butter was considered a luxury in some households, used very sparingly. Cheese was harder, tangier, and often quite dry. If you had a few good wheels stored away, it signified that the cow had been particularly productive that year. Dairy products, while useful, didn't always agree with people, and refrigeration was non-existent. Sour milk was used anyway. Butter would turn rancid. Cheese would grow mold. You simply cut away the most affected parts and hoped your digestive system was more robust than the bacteria. Beverages were straightforward. Water was often unreliable, frequently unsafe to drink, depending on the season and what your upstream neighbor had done carelessly. Therefore, ale was the standard drink. Weak ale, known as small beer, was brewed in most homes and consumed by everyone, including the children. It had a very low alcohol content, just enough to eliminate bacteria and slightly dull the sensation of thirst. If you had access to apples or pears, you might produce cider. Wine was reserved for the clergy and the nobility. Mead was uncommon. Milk was primarily for the very young and the infirm. Otherwise, it was ale with your morning meal, ale with your midday meal, and ale to help you forget that tomorrow's food would likely taste exactly like today's. Vegetables formed the largest part of your diet. Cabbage, onions, garlic, turnips, leeks. Carrots, though not the bright orange variety we know today, medieval carrots were typically white or purple. Most were grown in small, diligently tended gardens and consumed from root to leaf. Nothing was discarded. The tops of turnips might be boiled into greens. The outer skins were composted or thrown into the fire. Fruit was seasonal, mostly apples, perhaps some wild berries or plums gathered from the hedgerows. If you dried them, they might last through the winter. Otherwise, they were eaten quickly before they spoiled. Preservation was challenging. Sugar was almost entirely unaffordable. Honey, if you were lucky enough to have bees, was a highly valued sweetener. Otherwise, your pottage remained savory, in the broadest definition of that word. Herbs were cultivated, when possible. Parsley, sage, dill, mint. They were often used more for medicinal purposes or traditional beliefs than purely for flavor. Some herbs were believed to ward off illness, others kept insects away. Occasionally, they happened to make things taste slightly better, but that was a fortunate coincidence, not the primary goal. Meals were typically shared, eaten together on benches gathered around the fire. There were no distinct courses, no written recipes, just the pot, a piece of bread, and the hope that there would still be something left for the next day. You didn't voice complaints. Complaining didn't make the stew any thicker. If there was a special occasion, a wedding, a harvest celebration, a saint's day, you might roast a bird or bake a pie, not the light, flaky, buttery pies of today. A medieval pie was more like a solid crust case designed to hold a meat filling, often heavily spiced if spices were available, which they generally were not. You might use pepper, ginger, or cinnamon if someone had managed to trade successfully. Most days, however, were not feast days. Most days were quiet. You scraped your bowl clean, you soaked your bread, you drank your ale, and you leaned back, feeling full enough to get through the evening, even if not truly satisfied. There was comfort in the repetition, in knowing the predictable taste of the pot, in knowing how much bread remained, in watching the same familiar hands prepare the same meal by the same fire. As the wind whispered through the gaps in the wall, and the animals shifted in their sleep, the stew simmered, the bread cooled, and you had, once again, sufficient to survive. If you were a medieval peasant, you possessed very little. You might have a small patch of land to cultivate, a few simple tools, a couple of domestic animals, a dwelling you constructed yourself with uneven walls, but none of it was truly yours in ownership. It all belonged to the Lord. Not a distant king, not some mythical figure, just your local landholder. The individual who lived in a slightly larger, slightly less dilapidated structure up on the hill, with food that was marginally better and a roof that likely didn't leak. He owned the land, which meant he owned everything on it, including, in a certain sense, you. You were categorized as a villain. This term was not intended as an insult, it was simply a designation. You worked the land, but you did not own it. You were tied to it. You could not depart without obtaining permission. You could not pass it down freely upon your death. You were obligated to provide labor, goods, and respectful submission. You were not a slave, but you were certainly not entirely free either. Your relationship with the Lord was not based on mutual conversation. It was based on binding obligation. You did not speak directly to him. You spoke to his steward, the man responsible for managing the Lord's lands and, more crucially, keeping a meticulous account of what everyone owed. And you owed a substantial amount. Let's begin with labor. Several days each week, sometimes. More during the crucial harvest period, you were expected to work on the Lord's fields instead of your own. This was known as corvée labor. You received nothing for it, no payment, no expression of gratitude. Only the silent understanding that somewhere in the manor house, someone was consuming a richer meal because of the work you had done. You knew also owed taxes, and they manifested in numerous forms: a portion of your harvested grain, a share of your wool, a chicken here, a few eggs there. If you brewed ale, you owed a measure of ale. If you raised a pig, you owed cured bacon. If you managed to catch fish, well, guess who held dominion over the river? The taxes didn't stop with food. If you used the manor's mill to grind your grain, you paid a fee. This was required even though the mill was the only practical way to process your harvest, and even though the lord owned the mill and determined the charge. You might be tempted to grind it by hand, but doing so was frequently prohibited, punishable by a fine or something more severe, because the lord wasn't solely interested in collecting his share. He desired control. The same applied to the oven. Many manors had a communal oven, one you were required to pay to use. If you attempted to bake bread at your own hearth and the steward discovered it, there could be repercussions. You learned to conduct matters in the official manner, even if it consumed more time, cost more, and seemed illogical. And then there were various fees. Desiring to marry, pay a fee. Wishing to inherit your father's plot of land, there's a fee. Wanting to relocate to a different village, first, you must request permission. Then, as you might anticipate, pay a fee. Your livestock taxed. Your tools sometimes taxed. Your ability to reproduce without permission hardly taxed. And what did you receive in return? Well, the lord was theoretically supposed to offer you protection. If bandits attacked or a rival noble invaded, the lord maintained men-at-arms who could fight. If famine struck, he might distribute grain from his stores, although rarely without some form of cost or obligation. And if you had a legal disagreement, say your neighbor's goat wandered into your cultivated garden and stubbornly refused to leave, the lord's court might resolve it. Again, not for free. This was the feudal system, a complex structure of obligations and social stratification wrapped in the language of loyalty and mutual protection. In practical terms, it was a system of ownership. The land was paramount. Those who owned it ruled. Those who worked it obeyed. The manor house itself stood apart from the village, sometimes physically positioned on higher ground. It might be constructed of stone or substantial timber, noticeably larger than any peasant dwelling, with a thatched roof so dense that the wind scarcely dared to penetrate it. Inside were perhaps tapestries, sturdy tables, servants, and the lord himself, clad in wool, lined with animal fur, consuming meals you could barely conceive of, and giving very little thought to your individual existence. He might not know your name, but he was intimately aware of your numbers. How much barley you were obligated to provide this year, how many eggs you had promised, whether your son had reached the age where his name could be added to the labor rolls. Everything was meticulously recorded, not by you as you could not read, but by the steward, the reeve, the bailiff, men with wax tablets or pieces of parchment who came around asking questions you learned to answer cautiously. And if you failed to fulfill your obligations, there were consequences. Fines, usually meaning more goods were taken, additional days added to your required labor. In extreme circumstances, your tools could be confiscated, your land reclaimed, or your dwelling, your animals, your entire meager livelihood, all of it could be taken away. You did not openly resist. Resistance was not seen as rebellion. It was perceived as foolishness. But here lies the peculiar aspect. The system functioned, not because it was inherently just or kind, but because it was stable. It had established rules, harsh but predictable. You knew precisely what you owed. You knew exactly what was expected of you. There was no uncertainty, no sudden, unforeseen demands, only a steady, constant rhythm of giving, giving, giving. And occasionally, just occasionally, the Lord might offer something in return, a feast day where some food was shared, a holiday where labor was temporarily waived, a potentially kind word spoken from horseback as he passed. Not enough to genuinely balance the scales, but perhaps just enough to prevent things from tipping over completely. The relationship was never one of friendship, but it was one of enduring connection. Your lord might be youthful or elderly, benevolent or cruel, present or often absent, but it was always in a position of authority. You did not question this fundamental hierarchy. You bowed your head when he passed. You removed your cap. You used the appropriate words. Not necessarily because he deserved your deference, but because you sought to avoid difficulty. And perhaps buried deep within you a faint glimmer of hope persisted that one day you might be noticed, perhaps rewarded, slightly elevated in status, even just a little. It almost never transpired, but that is partly how the system maintained itself, not solely through fear, but through the faintest suggestion of hope that if you worked diligently enough, obeyed long enough, prayed fervently enough, something might eventually change. Meanwhile, the steward continued his rounds, the reeve continued his writing, the mill continued its grinding, and you continued to place your hands into the soil. Year after year, season after season, there was no concept of retirement, no bonus payment, no path for upward social movement, only the quiet internal knowledge that you had fulfilled your assigned role. You had accomplished what was asked of you. You had endured another year under the weight of someone else's title, and as long as the Lord remained satisfied, you were permitted to continue living. Long before the devastating arrival of the Black Death across Europe, an event now etched into the history books, medieval peasants were already intimately familiar with sickness. Not just the common illnesses that came and went with the changing seasons, although there was an abundance of those as well, but the pervasive, constant presence of something always waiting to afflict you. Infections, fevers, wasting away, swelling, persistent coughing. Disease was not an infrequent event. It was a fundamental aspect of daily life. You didn't require a continent-spanning catastrophe to be incapacitated. All it took was a minor cut that became infected, a single flea bite, a drink of water that appeared clean but was not. And unlike the weather or the demands of the Lord, illness followed no discernible rules. It arrived without warning and rarely departed quickly or quietly. There were no actual hospitals in the modern sense. If you were fortunate, your village had a wise woman, perhaps a skilled midwife, someone who understood which plants to steep and which ones to burn for poultices. If you were extremely fortunate, there might be a monk residing nearby, someone who was literate, well-intentioned, and slightly more effective than random prayer alone. But for the most part, when you fell ill, you remained in your own dwelling. You lay in your bed. You perspired heavily through your rough garment, and you simply hoped. Most people did not understand the true causes of disease. The concept of germs had not yet been conceived. Microscopes were centuries in the future. What people possessed were theories, ancient ones, often confusing and frequently inaccurate. Some believed in miasma, the notion of bad air that carried sickness through foul odors. If a village smelled strongly of rot, manure, and wood smoke, it was assumed to be unhealthy, which in a way was correct, though not for the reasons people believed. To counteract the bad air, people would stuff herbs into their clothing, carry bundles of flowers in their sleeves, or walk with cloths soaked in vinegar pressed to their faces. Not pleasant, not effective, but deeply ingrained beliefs. Others attributed illness to divine retribution. Sickness was seen as stemming from sin, from impure thoughts, acts of disobedience, or general moral decline. If your child became ill, it was viewed as a test of your faith. If your crops failed and subsequently your body weakened, it was likely your fault or your neighbor's or perhaps both. There were local traditions as well. Some believed illness originated from the evil eye, a malicious glance from someone filled with jealousy or anger. Others blamed the phases of the moon, the spirits of animals, or the displeasure of certain saints. One particularly widespread explanation was that sickness entered the body through the soles of the feet. The recommended solution? To boil them. And if that failed, to burn something nearby, possibly even your own mattress. The proposed remedies were as strange as the perceived causes. If you suffered from a fever, you might undergo bleeding. A local man would arrive with a simple blade, a collecting bowl, and more self-assurance than actual medical training. Sometimes leeches were employed, sometimes sharp stones. The underlying theory was to balance your body's humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. If these were out of balance, so were you. No one had ever seen these humours, of course, but they were blamed for almost every ailment. For swelling, various poultices were applied, smears of crushed herbs, mud, or even bread wrapped in cloth and tied to the affected area. Some occasionally worked, most did not. A few made things worse, but the crucial thing was that something was being done. If your stomach ached intensely, you might be given charcoal to chew. If you coughed up blood, you might be advised to drink wine mixed with crushed pearls. If your vision blurred, someone might whisper a prayer while blowing smoke over your head. If your leg turned a dark, unnatural color, you were likely beyond help. And then there were protective amulets, small pieces of metal or bone worn around the neck, sometimes inscribed with protective words, sometimes blessed by a priest. Some people buried onions in the corners of their homes, others hung garlic above their doors. One widely known remedy involved tying a live chicken to the infected area in the hope that the illness would transfer to the bird. It rarely did, but hope was a scarce commodity, and people desperately clung to whatever offered a possibility. Sickness was a solitary experience in many ways, but not in the way we think of it today. You didn't go into strict quarantine, you didn't summon professional help, you just tried to continue working until your body absolutely would not allow it. When that moment arrived, you lay down, and everyone else continued with their tasks. The children were fed, the animals were fed, you might be given some weak broth, and a few softly murmured prayers. Sometimes illness would pass, the fever would subside, the swelling would diminish. You would eventually walk again, slowly, perhaps with a new limp and a deeper appreciation for warm soup. Other times it did not pass, and your family would light a single candle by your bedside. Plague, in the broader sense, wasn't always the dramatic, rapid kind that filled carts with bodies. More frequently, it was a slow, insidious infection, skin darkening, limbs swelling, a cough so deep it seemed to shake the very walls of the house. Smallpox, leprosy, dysentery, even a common flu could sweep through a village and leave half the population confined to their beds. There were no official counts of the sick, no statistical charts, only the spreading stories. A person arriving from another village mentioned that the cough had begun there the week before. Or someone had heard that 3 young children had perished near the river. You paid close attention. You began boiling your water more diligently. You left herbs under the door. You kept your distance from those who seemed unwell, even if no one explicitly stated why. Death was not always a source of intense fear, but it was certainly acknowledged and recognized. People knew when it was imminent. They recognized the telltale signs. Breathing that became shallow and slow, skin that felt cold to the touch, eyes that became dull and distant. There were prayers for those near death, soft whispers spoken by firelight. When the Black Death finally arrived in the 14th century, it struck with a ferocity that overshadowed everything that had come before. But by then, the world was already accustomed to the presence of widespread sickness. The notion that you could be perfectly healthy in the morning and gone by nightfall was not new. It was simply happening much more frequently and with greater intensity. The plague returned in waves, and each time it came back, it seemed stronger, stranger. Lumps swelling in the neck and groin, fever that stole the mind and coherence, blood that darkened and seemed to bubble. People died within days, sometimes in mere hours. Entire villages were wiped out. Fields lay untended. Bells rang almost continuously, then stopped ringing altogether because there was no one left to ring them. Some peasants desperately attempted to flee, but disease travels faster than human feet. Others turned to religious devotion, intensifying their prayers, self-flagellating, vowing to live more righteous lives if they were spared. A few turned to violence, blaming outsiders, blaming sinners, blaming anyone but the unseen force that afflicted them. The church attempted to offer explanations and solace and the promise of proper burial. Monks died in large numbers. Priests vanished. In some places, death became so commonplace that the customary funerals were omitted. Bodies were interred in mass graves, often without individual names. And yet, amidst all this, life somehow persevered. People learned how to survive, alongside perpetual sickness. They accepted it in the same way they accepted the constant presence of hunger or the biting cold, not with joy, but with a kind of weary, deep-seated resilience. They cleaned their homes more often. They shared what limited medicinal herbs they possessed. They whispered new prayers, perhaps mixing Christian rites with older traditions. Some believed that having survived one illness offered a degree of protection against the next. Others held no such belief, but they still rose each morning and attended to their animals. Children grew up learning which plants were dangerous to touch, which ones could be chewed for ailments, and which ones needed to be boiled until they no longer had a strong odor. They learned how to bind a wound, how to wait out a fever, how to recognize when someone was not going to recover, and when it was time to cease hoping. And throughout it all, they did not cease living. They married. They brought in the harvests. They shared meals, such as they were. They sat by the fire and recounted stories of the most recent illness that had swept through, and the time someone's grandfather had survived a winter fever with nothing but garlic water and sheer stubbornness. Plague was not perceived as the ultimate end of the world. It was simply another harsh, unpredictable element of it. And for those who endured, survival itself became a form of resistance, a quiet, unyielding refusal to surrender easily, a fundamental belief that tomorrow would dawn. And if it did not, for them, someone else would remember their name, or at the very least, the way they always added a sprig of rosemary to the simmering broth. Night in the medieval countryside was not peaceful in the way we might imagine. It was silent in the way a deep cave is silent, filled with subtle creaks, distant animal sounds, and the kind of profound quiet that makes you acutely aware of the sounds of your own body. The day concluded when the natural light disappeared, and anything that had not already been attended to had to be dealt with immediately, because once darkness descended, your world shrank to the immediate vicinity of your hearth. There was no artificial light source burning freely throughout the night. Wax was too precious. If you possessed a tallow lamp, it was reserved for genuine emergencies or moments of religious devotion. Most nights the fire was allowed to dim, the coals glowing softly, and that provided the only illumination. And so you slept, but not in the unbroken stretch common today. Sleep in the Middle Ages often occurred in two distinct phases. First, sleep, followed by a period of wakefulness, and then a second sleep. This rhythm was not accidental. It was how people adapted to the long, dark hours between sunset and sunrise. You would typically fall into your first sleep relatively soon after nightfall. The fire would be banked, the animals would have quieted, the children would have been hushed. The dwelling, a one-room, perhaps two, tinny, would settle into stillness. If you had a mattress, it was filled with straw or feathers, likely lumpy, and often shared with others. If you did not, you slept on woven rushes spread on the ground, softened only by long habit. Everyone slept together. Immediate family, extended, relatives, even hired help if applicable, all in one shared space. Not out of a sense of preferred closeness, but out of necessity. It was the only room in the dwelling that retained any significant warmth. On the most frigid nights, even certain animals were brought inside. A goat near the entrance, a dog curled close to the hearth, chickens in a basket. Warmth was a more critical consideration than personal boundaries. There was no concept of privacy in this shared sleep. The idea of sleeping entirely alone was associated with punishment or illness, not comfort. The wealthy might afford solitude, everyone else simply made do. You would turn towards the wall. You might stuff straw into your ears. You shared blankets. You breathed in the air warmed by each other's presence. And if someone snored, which someone invariably did, you simply became accustomed to the sound. The first sleep usually lasted for several hours. Then, almost with predictable regularity, people would awaken. This was not disruptive, it was anticipated. During this period, often around the midnight hour, the world was still and quiet. Some individuals would pray, others would stir the embers of the fire, some might use the chamber pot or venture briefly outside into the cold air. Some would reflect on their day or their lives, others would whisper quietly with a spouse or relative. It was also considered a time for dreams, often vivid and impactful ones. People believed this midnight interval opened a thin veil between the earthly realm and the spiritual, between the sacred and the everyday. If you experienced a dream during this waking period, you were likely to remember it clearly and discuss it the following morning, not in passing, but as something significant. Eventually, the second sleep would begin, typically deeper and more restful. This was the sleep that facilitated healing, or at least attempted to. It was during this time that the day's aches might lessen slightly, when blisters from labor cooled down. If you were fortunate, it remained uninterrupted. If you were not, you simply lay still and waited for the first hint of dawn to signal the acceptable time to rise. The home didn't go silent at night, not entirely. The fire crackled, wind whispered through the thatch, a baby might fuss, a cow might shuffle its hooves. Sometimes the night was broken by coughing, the wet, rattling kind that never seemed to end. And everyone noticed, but no one said anything. It was understood. The fear of the dark was real and not irrational. The night carried real dangers, both imagined and entirely physical. Wolves, for instance. In some regions, their howls came close enough to the village to raise hairs on the back of your neck. They weren't just creatures of legend, they were real and hungry. Then there were thieves, rogues, strangers, fires that started from a careless coal, roofs that groaned under snow, and less explainable things. Ghosts, spirits, demons, witches. You didn't talk about them openly, but you knew they were out there. To protect the household, you followed rituals. You placed iron by the door, made the sign of the cross above the hearth, whispered protective blessings over the straw mattress, hung herbs, rosemary, sage, rue, above entryways. Sometimes you tied a bit of string around a child's wrist just in case. Even with protection, some families believed that sleep left you vulnerable, that the soul wandered while the body rested. So people tucked in carefully, covered mirrors, faced the bed toward the fire, avoided sleeping with their feet pointed toward the door. The cold was its own enemy. It seeped through walls, through thatch, through poorly sealed doors. People didn't sleep under mounds of blankets. They layered wool, fur, cloaks, tunics. The idea of undressing for bed would have seemed absurd. You slept in your clothes, sometimes in your boots. There was a comfort to sleeping next to others, but also discomfort. Someone always shifted, someone always murmured. There were elbows, knees, the occasional surprise from the family dog. But this was normal. You didn't expect silence. You expected closeness. And in that closeness, you found a strange kind of security. You heard your father breathe, your child twitch, your grandmother mutter a prayer in her sleep. It wasn't peaceful, but it was human. It was shared. When you dreamed, your dreams mattered. A field of wheat might mean prosperity. A snake illness, a broken tooth could mean death. You learned to interpret these things. Or you found someone who could. The village had dream readers, not officially, but everyone knew who to ask. The church had its own ideas. It warned that some dreams were from the devil. That sleep was a time when temptation could slip in. You were told to pray before bed, to avoid certain thoughts, to keep your soul ready in case the night was your last, because it could be. People went to sleep and didn't wake up. Illness could take hold while you rested. A fever could rise, a cough could deepen, and by morning someone might be gone quietly, as if stolen. This uncertainty gave every morning a slightly reverent tone. When the light returned and the rooster cried out and the coals were stirred back to life, it meant you'd survived again. You sat up slowly. Every joint reminded you of your age, no matter how young you were. The cold bit your nose, you wiped your face. You looked around and counted bodies. Everyone who stirred was accounted for. Everyone who didn't was checked on. And then once the living were confirmed, the day began. Water was fetched, bread was prepared, animals were fed. The dream you had, if it was important, was shared, and the memory of the night faded, not erased, just softened, folded into the next stretch of time. In winter, sleep came early and stayed late. In summer, it shortened, but the rhythm remained. First sleep, a waking hour, second sleep. A world without clocks, but not without routine. And for all its discomfort, there was something grounding in that rhythm, something honest. You didn't aim for comfort, you aimed for endurance. And if you happened to find rest along the way, a moment of warmth, a particularly quiet night, a dream, that didn't leave you afraid, that was a gift, one you didn't question, one you didn't expect to gain too soon. Some years you're simply hungry, other years you're in a famine. It's not the same. Hunger is manageable, it has rules. You stretch food, you ration, you hope. But famine breaks the rules. It's when the fields fail, the root cellar is bare. And there's no more pretending that next week will be better. It's when food becomes an idea more than a substance. In a medieval village, you often saw it coming. It started in the spring. Too much rain or none. The barley came, up patchy. The beans flowered, then browned. The cabbages cracked open too early. The wheat head stayed stunted, bowed like they were already mourning something. You noticed? Everyone did. At first, no one said it. But the looks were exchanged, the calculations made quietly internally. How much is left from last year? How Much seed can we keep? How much can we afford to eat? The answers were never good. The hardest part was knowing what to do next. Not in winter, but in summer, because that's when you had to choose between planting the seeds or grinding them into flour, between saving for a harvest that might never come or feeding your child one more bowl of something warm. And so the portions began to shrink. The ahi stew got thinner, the bread got smaller, the bowls didn't come back empty, they just came back less often. You didn't panic, not yet. You told yourself this happened once before, or that another village might have extra, or that the manor stores could fill in the gaps. Hope was still on the table, just not much else. By August, it became harder to ignore. By September, it became impossible. You stopped feeding the animals first. Chickens were quiet. The goats' bleeding grew hollow. The dog, if you had one, stopped barking and started following you more closely, like it understood it was next. Bread became ritual. One loaf split 5 ways. Everyone chewed slower. No one commented on the crust. Even the smallest crumb was swept up with reverence. The stew was now mostly water. If it had color, it was from the pot. You boiled weeds. You ground roots. You pulled up things you didn't recognize and hoped they weren't poisonous. Some weren't. You didn't sleep through the night, not because you were afraid, but because your stomach reminded you every few hours that it was still empty. The children asked fewer questions. That's how you knew it was real. They didn't ask when the bread was coming. They didn't ask for honey. They didn't beg for stories. They sat close to the fire and stared. They learned how to wait. And your neighbors, you stopped seeing them outside. The village quieted. No more laughter in the lane, no more arguments about sheep, just the occasional cough or crack of firewood. Famine didn't make people cruel, it made them silent. Sometimes someone would bring back a rabbit or a bird, or a handful of acorns that could be soaked and ground. You chewed them even when they still tasted bitter. You smiled anyway, not because it tasted good, but because it was something. You tried not to resent the manor. Sometimes they gave grain, sometimes they didn't. The steward came around less. That was good and bad. Good because he wasn't there to take anything. Bad because he wasn't there to help either. His silence said more than words ever could. The church did what it could. Bread after mass, alms for the poorest, but they too were stretched. You prayed more, not out of faith, but out of repetition. Words are easy when your hands are too tired to do anything else. Some left the village entirely, packed up and wandered to find work or food or God. Some returned, some didn't. You never asked what happened. You were too tired. The body changes in famine. You feel your ribs first, not from the outside, but from within, like they're too close to your skin. You stand up slower. You bruise easier. You wake up with your hands clenched, like they're still gripping tools you can't afford to use anymore. And the cold hurts more. The fire is your best friend. You spend more time tending it than you ever did cooking on it. You sit close. You sleep facing it. You feed it, even as your belly goes empty, because heat is the one luxury you can still provide. By now you've eaten everything that could be eaten, the roots, the weeds, the dried beans, the stale flour. You've boiled bones 3 times over. You've soaked bark. You've baked famine bread that cracked your tooth. And when the food was gone, you looked to the things that weren't food, but might become food in the right light. Lever, boiled and salted. Not delicious, not satisfying, but technically chewable. You found a rat once. You didn't scream. You thanked God. Then you hid it.
cooked it alone, told no one.
You still feel guilty, but you don't regret it. The dreams become strange. You dream of feasts, tables full of roast and bread and wine. You wake up chewing your tongue. You dream of boiling things over and over, even though you haven't boiled anything in 3 days. You dream of animals coming back, of green shoots breaking through snow. You dream of your childhood when hunger was simpler. And some nights you dream of being full. You wake from those crying. The graveyard grew slowly, at first, then quickly, then too quickly to keep up. You knew someone had died when the church bell didn't ring. It meant there weren't enough hands to lift the rope. The grave was shallow. The prayer was short. The mourning was silent. Everyone had their own hunger to manage. You wanted to mourn, but you couldn't afford the emotion. You held it back, like everything else. Then, like every famine, it ended. Not suddenly, but steadily. Rain came and it stayed. The ground softened. Seeds germinated. Plants reached up. Weak, but real. You had enough energy to hope again. You saved the first harvest for others, children first, elders next. You took the smallest bowl. You smiled as you passed it, and when the first good loaf came out of the oven cracked on top, dark on the bottom, you stared at it before you ate.
You remembered every day you went without, every trick you used, every lie you told to spare someone else. You ate slowly, and this time it filled you. By the time you possessed the ability to walk, the church had already claimed you. It had recorded
your name during the baptismal ceremony, blessed your initial breaths with Latin phrases you would never truly comprehend, and woven your soul into a vast, intricate system that extended far beyond the boundaries of your small village. You belonged to the church not as a matter of personal choice, but because there were simply no other viable options. In the quiet moments of your life, those dim, early mornings before the fire had fully caught, those wet nights when the wind howled fiercely through the shuttered openings, you felt its presence like an undeniable gravitational pull. It didn't merely exist alongside your life, it structured it, judged it, levied taxes upon it, offered forgiveness for it, and ultimately defined what came after it. The church was not simply a physical location you visited occasionally. It was the air that surrounded you, the very ground you walked upon, the fundamental rhythm of your entire year. It was the voice that would one day murmur over your burial site, and the voice that spoke about that very possibility decades before you
reached it.
The village priest, often the only person in the community who possessed the skill of reading and writing, was far more than just your confessor. He was also your living calendar, your primary source of counsel, and the closest thing you had to an oracle. He held the keys to understanding the mysteries of the heavens and the ancient stories of the saints, and he was believed to know why a pig might suddenly die, or why a destructive storm might approach. He moved through the village community like a man carrying both blessing and implicit threat within the folds of his robes. You would bring your sins to him, confessed in hushed whispers, desperately hoping that he would not reveal his disappointment in your transgressions. You tried diligently not to dwell on the extent of what he potentially knew about your inner life. You encountered him at the significant life events, birth, marriage, and death, the only truly guaranteed ceremonies within a peasant's existence. And in the intervals between these milestones, he spoke on behalf of a deity whom you feared more than you loved, because love, you were repeatedly told, required absolute obedience. Latin was the sacred language of the Mass, and to your ears, It might as well have been a magical incantation. You would stand within the cold church walls alongside your family, your feet numb from the chill, listening to words that felt utterly disconnected from your daily life. You did not understand what the priest was saying as he elevated the bread and wine, but you believed, or you desperately tried to believe, that something unseen and profound was occurring, that the bread was no longer merely bread, that the wine was no longer simply wine, that the complex murmuring of ancient words and prescribed gestures could somehow interact with the divine realm. You did not speak these words yourself, but they seemed to move through you nonetheless. You would mouth along with what you could discern. You would cross yourself when everyone else did. You learned the rhythm of holiness the way one learns, the path to a well without fully understanding the geology of every step, only that you needed it to survive. The church dictated precisely when you were to fast and when you were permitted to feast. It meticulously divided the year into sacred periods: Lent, Advent, Epiphany, All Saints' Day. You didn't refer to months by their names like March or April. You referred to them by their relation to religious events, after Easter or near St. Michael's Day. It informed you exactly what types of food you were allowed to consume, at what times you could eat them, and how much guilt you should feel about any pleasure you might derive from eating. 40 days without meat before Easter, followed by a celebration so rich and unfamiliar it could make you feel lightheaded. Fish required on Fridays, even if you resided in a place nowhere near a body of water substantial enough to catch fish. Almond milk for the affluent, turnips and cold broth for everyone else. On the days honoring saints, you shared whatever meager food you possessed. On days designated for fasting, you allowed yourself to imagine the abundance you lacked. But even when your bowl was empty, your life was filled with the rigid structure of rules. Your personal calendar was not solely for religious observance. It was also for financial obligations. The church demanded and collected 1/10 of your annual yield, regardless of the generosity or harshness of the season: grain, eggs, wool, chickens, homemade cider. If it originated from your cultivated field or the efforts of your body, it had a price attached. You provided this 10th portion because you were told it was God's due. That was the explanation you were given. But God did not physically collect it. The priest did, or more often the steward with his ubiquitous ledgers and silent, judgmental nods. You would watch your best barley being transported by cart to the tithe barn, which was invariably larger and sturdier than your own dwelling. You saw your neighbors hand over their last sack of oats while the priest offered prayers for mercy that they had, in effect, just paid for. And when the harvest failed completely, when the rains arrived too late or the frost descended too early, the demand for the tithe did not lessen. You owed what you owed, no matter the circumstances. Sometimes they permitted you to pay in handmade candles or additional labor. Sometimes they did not. Sometimes the burden of debt grew so heavy that it felt like a physical weight pressing down on your back, even when you were standing upright. But the church did not only take, it also provided, although not always in the way you might have desired. It provided stories, it provided a sense of structure and order, it provided explanations for the unexplainable. When your valuable cow unexpectedly died without any apparent cause, the priest informed you which specific saint to invoke in prayer. When your child fell gravely ill, he might tell you that it was a test of your faith, or perhaps a punishment for some hidden sin, or even the work of the devil infiltrating through a crack in your belief. He offered blessings and sacred sacraments, instructed you to light a candle or visit a local shrine. Occasionally, he might give you a small fragment of a relic, a piece of old bone, a tooth, a strip of fabric said to have been soaked in the blood of some long-forgotten martyr. You held this object as if it were priceless treasure. Sometimes it seemed to work. Sometimes it did not. But even when it failed, it felt preferable to having nothing at all to turn to. There were saints dedicated to almost every conceivable need or problem. Saint Apollonia for the relief of toothache. Saint Isidore for success in ploughing the fields. Saint Sebastian for protection against the plague. You had no knowledge of where they were interred or when they had lived. You only knew their names and the specific ailments or troubles they were said to be able to alleviate. Their stories were a mixture of vague memory and mystical legend, recounted in the flickering light of the fire by people who weren't sure where truth ended and legend began. You called on them when you had nothing else. You whispered their names as you stirred the pot or knelt in the field. You made deals with them, promised bread or fasting or a pilgrimage, if only they'd help you this once. Sometimes they did, or seemed to. And that was enough to ask again. Pilgrimage was a holy journey, but also a way to leave. For a few days, you stepped outside the same 5 miles you'd lived your entire life. You walked roads you didn't know toward shrines you'd only heard of. You carried your prayers with you, strapped to your back, clutched in your hands. You slept under hedges or in the corners of barns. You arrived footsore and raw, stood before a bone or a statue, and hoped something would shift inside you. Sometimes it did. You returned, not healed, but changed, or at least tired enough to believe you had been. Even death was a ritual choreographed by the church. When you felt it near, you sent for the priest. He came with oil and words. He touched your forehead, prayed over your body, tried to ease your soul into what came next. Your family gathered. The candles were lit. The bell might ring if someone had the strength. You were buried on sacred ground beside others who had walked the same path. And then came the masses. Your family lit more candles, paid for prayers, hoped the priest remembered your name in his chants. Because even in death there were debts. The church taught that your soul might not go straight to heaven. It might linger in purgatory, a shadowed hallway between suffering and salvation. You could wait there for years or centuries or longer unless someone helped, unless someone prayed, paid, lit enough candles, said your name often enough to pull you through. And so your family paid what they could. The poor gave bread, the rich gave land, all to shorten a stay in a place no one had seen, but everyone feared. Because fear, too, was part of the church's gift. The church explained the world when no one else could. It told you why the rains failed, why your child didn't wake, why illness took the young and spared the cruel. It told you that suffering had purpose, that obedience had reward. It gave you structure in the middle of chaos, and that structure, even when it burdened you, gave you peace. Not comfort always, but peace. You never questioned the church's power, not seriously, not out loud. You might grumble about the tithe or curse when the priest looked the other way, but you never stopped showing up. You didn't stop kneeling. You didn't stop crossing yourself when the bell rang, because if the church wasn't right, then the world had no shape at all, and a world with no shape was a terrifying thing. Even when the priest drank too much, even when the bishop demanded too many taxes, even when the indulgent seller passed through town with a cart full of promises and a purse full of coins, you still believed, or you acted like you did, which in the end was mostly the same because belief was less about what you thought than what you did. You didn't understand the Latin, but you understood the structure. You stayed inside it because it was the only way forward. And when you died, you hoped the bells would ring and the candles would burn.
And your name would be said often enough to matter. You hoped the saints still listened. You hoped your sins had been counted and forgiven in equal measure. You hoped the church in all its weight and mystery and dust and gold would carry you the rest of the way.
There is no architectural plan, no skilled builder, no carefully sorted pile of timber waiting to be assembled. Just mud, wood, and whatever raw materials the surrounding land hasn't already claimed. Your dwelling isn't a house, not in the way modern folk conceive of one. It's more like a constant negotiation between providing shelter and withstanding the weather, between the effort you put in and the steady progress of decay, between your basic needs and what the ground grudgingly allows you to take. You start with the basic frame.
Roughly hewn timbers from the closest trees, cut with tools that have been used by more hands than you can count. The wood isn't perfectly straight. It bends a little, it warps, but you don't mind. Your walls aren't perfectly straight either.
Once the frame stands, you weave thin branches or flexible sticks between the upright posts, a process called wattle. It's not elegant work. It's not particularly fast, but it holds together mostly much like the rest of your existence. Then comes the daub, a mixture of mud, straw, animal dung, and water. You apply it by hand, slapping it onto the woven wattles, pressing it into the gaps. You smooth it just enough to block the wind and perhaps fool yourself into thinking it looks deliberate. It dries slowly, cracking in the sun, occasionally shedding large clumps that must be replaced before winter sets in. You grow, accustomed to the smell. Eventually you cease to notice it. The roof is thatch, thick layers of dried straw packed tightly together and secured to the beams. When it's fresh, it has a golden appearance, almost beautiful. Then the rain begins, then the birds arrive, then time takes its toll. The color fades, the edges become frayed, holes appear in places you never anticipated, and you start placing buckets in spots you hoped you'd never need them. You don't cover it with tiles, you don't waterproof it, you just keep patching it, adding more straw, until the entire roof threatens to become more patch than original roof. At some point, you might idly wonder if living under an overturned cart might be simpler. The floor is simply earth. You tell yourself it's packed hard, and in a way, it is. Years of walking, sweeping, accidental spills, and heavy footsteps have compressed it into something resembling solid ground. But when it rains heavily, it softens again. When it freezes, it cracks. When the goats are brought inside for the night, it's anyone's guess what you're actually stepping on. You might spread rushes or loose straw to provide some covering. It helps a little. But soon the straw becomes damp, gets dirty, is trampled into dust. Then you either sweep it out and start over, or you don't. Eventually the straw becomes just another layer of the floor, and you accept it as part of the natural environment indoors. Windows are, by definition, openings in the wall anyway. They are covered by wooden shutters that swing awkwardly and never quite close tightly. Glass is far too costly, too rare, too easily broken, so the wind finds its way inside, the cold penetrates, the sounds of the animals outside filter in, and sometimes the animals themselves make their
Way inside.
There's a single door, usually hung a bit crooked because the frame shifted during the last hard frost. It fastens with a simple hook or a wooden peg, not for protection, there's nothing valuable enough to steal, but to prevent the chicken from wandering out and the wind from wandering in. Inside, the arrangement is best described as communal. One room, perhaps two, if someone has managed to add a small lean-to or a sleeping loft, but typically just one shared space where you sleep, consume your food, prepare meals, mend clothing, converse, argue, and hope. Everyone lives here. Parents, children, a relative or two, an elder, perhaps a neighbor's child whose parents are ill or gone. There is a hearth in the center, built of stone if you are fortunate, clay if you are not. The smoke rises through a hole in the roof, more or less. There is no chimney. The air inside is perpetually smoky, always a little warm, a little humid, and always carrying the faint scent of stew that has been warmed up one too many times. Furniture is sparse: a table, a bench, possibly a stool. A chest if someone in your family possessed unusual skill at carving or was exceptionally lucky in their marriage. Beds are wooden frames filled with straw or feathers, often shared, usually creaking with every movement. Blankets are wool, heavy, rough, and never quite completely dry. There is storage in the rafters. Strings of garlic, onions, dried herbs, perhaps a small preserved ham if the pig was healthy that year. You can discern the difference between early winter and late spring simply by the smell in the air above your head. Sometimes it's comforting. Sometimes it's a stark reminder of how close you are to depletion. Animals are part of the household. Quite literally, the cow might sleep in the same room confined to a corner. Chickens as well, a goat. It's not ideal, it's not sanitary by modern standards, but it is warm. You learn to disregard the clucking and shuffling and the occasional startled bleating sound in the middle of the night. They are part of the ambient noise, like the wind rustling through the thatch or the slow groaning of the walls as they settle. Nothing is truly level. The floor dips, the roof slants, the walls bulge slightly as if the entire structure is gently breathing in and out with the changing seasons. You repair what you can manage. You ignore what you cannot. Every spring, you vow to fix the leaning back wall. Every autumn, it is still leaning. It is not a dwelling constructed for permanence. It is a dwelling constructed to endure the next storm. And yet, despite all its imperfections, and there are many, it is home. You know precisely where the cold air enters and how to block it with an old sack. You know which roof beam is strong, enough to hang a cooking pot from, and which one creaks when someone stands too near. You know how the sunlight falls through the gaps in the afternoon, and where the dog reliably curls up to sleep. When strangers pass through, they observe poverty. You see resourcefulness, constant effort, the repurposing of materials. A roof that hasn't yet collapsed is a small triumph. A fire that still smoulders at dawn is a blessing. A corner that remains dry is worth more than any precious metal. And when you lie down at the end of the day, surrounded by the sounds of sleep, the quiet presence of animals, the scent of smoke and straw, you feel a strange sense of comfort. Not pride exactly, but simply a sense of being present. This is your space. It bends, it leaks, it shifts in the wind, but it has held firm. And so have you.